Welcome to Reform Thinking. So, um, I want you to imagine something for a second. Picture yourself as a missionary back in May of 1738.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah. And you are sitting in this room in London, and you are you are utterly, hopelessly depressed.
Man, that is a rough place to be.
It really is. You just sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, right? You survived these brutal storms, spent months in the colonial wilderness of Georgia trying to convert the indigenous tribes, and you failed.
Is completely struck out.
Miserably. You return to England completely broken. And you write this sentence in your journal that shows like a devastating level of self-awareness. You wrote, "I went to America to convert the Indians, but oh, who shall convert me?"
Wow. That is a brutal admission for someone who, dedicated his entire life to religious work. I mean, he was ordained, he was highly educated, he was doing all the external actions a religious person is supposed to do, but internally he realized he possessed absolutely nothing of substance.
So, this man, John Wesley, he goes to a religious meeting on Aldersgate Street in London on May 24th. And he notes in his journal that he went very unwillingly.
He really did not want to be there.
Not at all. But at 8:45 in the evening, someone at the front of the room starts reading from Martin Luther's commentary on the opening chapters of Paul's letter to the Romans.
Oh, that is a huge moment.
It is. And Wesley writes that as he listened to that explanation, he felt his heart strangely warmed. In that precise moment, he finally trusted Christ alone for salvation.
Which is just incredible.
And the trajectory of his life, and really the trajectory of England, shifted overnight.
It highlights this fascinating domino effect, you know?
Yeah, how so?
Well, Wesley's realizations sparked the Wesleyan revival, which just swept across the British Isles and altered the course of Western history. But if we trace the dominoes backward, Wesley was listening to Martin Luther's commentary.
Right.
And what caused Martin Luther to write that commentary? What altered Luther's life centuries earlier? It was one single phrase from Romans chapter 1, verse 17, which is, "The just shall live by faith."
That phrase is what pulled Luther out of a crushing system of religious guilt.
Yeah, Luther was this Augustinian monk who was driving his superiors crazy. He would spend hours in confession trying to remember every single minor infraction he had committed.
Just agonizing over every little thing.
Exactly. I mean, he understood the holy standard of God, and he realized his own massive shortfall. He was sleeping on freezing stone floors, whipping himself, starving himself, just trying to generate enough righteousness to appease a holy God.
And then he reads Romans.
Yes. And the text argues that righteousness is not something you generate. It is something you receive by faith.
I think about the religious systems Wesley and Luther were trapped in like an impossible treadmill.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, they cranked the speed up to an absolute sprint, and they elevated the incline to the maximum level. They are running until their lungs burn and their legs give out, trying to reach heaven, but they are glued to the same spot.
They are completely exhausted.
Right. And then Paul's letter to the Romans reaches over and pulls the plug on the treadmill. The text says, you cannot run there. You have to step off the machine entirely and receive the finish line as a gift.
That captures the psychological relief perfectly. And think about the historical weight of this single document.
It is massive.
Two massive historical movements in the Western world. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century and the Wesleyan revival in the 18th century, they were birthed from the same biblical text written in the 1st century.
Just staggering to think about.
Paul wrote it in AD 56. Luther analyzed it 1,500 years later. Wesley heard Luther's analysis 200 years after that. Truth possesses a compounding, lasting ripple effect across centuries.
But that raises a massive question for me. Why this specific letter?
What do you mean?
Well, we are doing a deep dive today into Warren W. Wiersbe's commentary on the first chapter of Romans. And the mission for the listeners is to understand how a piece of correspondence from the ancient world continues to spark mass revivals.
Right?
There are thousands of ancient texts. We have the writings of Aristotle, Plato, the Stoics. Why does Romans cut through the noise so effectively?
Because Romans offers an airtight, logical progression that dismantles human pride.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Most philosophies or religious texts start by giving you a list of things to do to improve yourself. Romans starts by proving you cannot improve yourself. It strips away all the complicated, self-righteous systems human beings build.
Yeah, it really goes.
The letter was carried across the Roman Empire by a deaconess named Sister Phoebe. She physically carried this scroll from Corinth to Rome. And contained in that scroll is the most terrifyingly precise diagnosis of the human condition ever written.
It is an active courtroom proceeding where humanity itself is put on trial.
Spot on. It really is a trial.
Before we walk into that courtroom, though, we have to look at the guy holding the pen. If I am Martin Luther or John Wesley, and I am staking my eternal destiny on this document, I need to know why I should trust the author.
That is a fair point.
If we look at Paul on paper, he seems like the least likely candidate to write a manual for the capital of the known world. He is writing to believers in Rome, a city he has never visited. He has to introduce himself and present his credentials.
And he presents those credentials in a way that is completely upside down to the culture. He uses 3 titles in his introduction: a slave of Jesus Christ, an emissary or apostle, and a preacher of the good news.
We have to unpack that first title. He calls himself a servant, but Wiersbe points out the Greek word Paul used is doulos, which translates to a literal bond slave.
Which is a heavy word.
To our modern ears, that is jarring, but in the Roman Empire, it was a cultural shock of massive proportions.
Historians estimate there were upwards of 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire. Society ran on slave labor.
60 million. That is a staggering number.
And a slave was not viewed as a human being with agency. A slave was viewed as a piece of property. They had no rights. They could be bought, sold, or killed at the whim of their owner.
So here is Paul, writing to the apex of human civilization, a city obsessed with status, dominance, and military might, and he introduces himself by voluntarily taking the lowest possible social rank.
He willingly enslaves himself to Christ.
I keep thinking about this like a modern resume. If you were applying for a leadership role or trying to influence the most elite boardroom on earth, you do not put willing property at the top of your LinkedIn profile.
No, you definitely do not.
You lift your degrees. You list the companies you have conquered. Paul flips the script entirely. He argues that true authority comes from absolute total submission to God.
And Paul had a resume he could have bragged about. Before his conversion on the road to Damascus, he was a Pharisee.
The elite of the elite.
Right. The Pharisees were the intellectual and religious elite of the Jewish nation. The word Pharisee literally means separated one. They were separated to the strict observance of the Jewish law.
So they were highly educated, rigorous, and respected.
Yes. And Paul points out that he shifted his entire separation. He used to be separated to the law. Now he is separated to the gospel.
But he makes sure the Romans understand this gospel is not some new, trendy philosophy he dreamed up in the desert.
Rome loved new philosophies, but they also respected antiquity. If something was ancient, it carried weight.
Ah, I see.
So Paul roots his message firmly in the Hebrew scriptures. He points all the way back to Genesis 3.15 to the prophets like Isaiah. He tells them, this is not a novel invention. This is an ancient promise fulfilled.
He also grounds the whole thing in physical, historical reality. He references the physical lineage of Jesus through the family of King David, and he points to the bodily resurrection.
He demands that the Romans treat his message as historical fact, not spiritual myth.
Which was a big deal back then.
Massive. The Greeks and Romans had hundreds of myths about gods coming down to earth, doing supernatural things, and returning to Mount Olympus. But those stories happened in some vague, mythical past.
Right, like once upon a time.
Exactly. Paul argues against that. He insists this happened in their actual timeline. Jesus was a real man, born into a specific royal family, died a physical death under a Roman governor, and experienced a literal bodily resurrection that was witnessed by hundreds of people.
Okay, so he establishes his authority through submission, and he proves his message is grounded in verifiable history. But I am stuck on the relationship aspect here.
The pastoral side of things.
Yeah. He did not plant the churches in Rome. He's never met the majority of these people, yet he writes to them with this intense pastoral affection. He tells them he prays for them constantly.
He expresses a massive amount of concern. He loves them, and the text highlights a fascinating dynamic. He feels an intense, crippling debt to them.
Let's look at the wording Wiersbe highlights. Paul says he is a debtor to both Greeks and barbarians.
We have to understand the cultural snobbery of the first century. The Greeks, and by extension the Romans who absorbed Greek culture, viewed anyone who did not speak their language or share their philosophy as an uneducated barbarian.
Just looking down their noses at everyone else.
Very much so. The word barbarian actually comes from the Greeks mimicking the sound of foreign languages. They thought it just sounded like bar, bar, bar.
Oh, wow, really? That is fascinating.
Yeah. If you were not Greek or Roman, you were lesser. Paul shatters that elitism completely. He insists the good news is a debt owed to all humanity, regardless of their cultural status or education.
I am having a hard time wrapping my head around that kind of debt. I understand feeling indebted to a bank that loaned me money, or feeling a debt of gratitude to a person who saved my life.
Sure.
But how can a human being feel a genuine obligation to people they have never laid eyes on?
It comes down to the nature of the commission Paul received. When Christ stopped Paul on the road to Damascus, he did not just grant Paul salvation. He handed him a stewardship.
A stewardship of the message.
Right. Paul was entrusted with a message meant for the nations. When you are handed something of infinite value that belongs to other people, you are in debt to those people until you deliver it.
Okay, that makes the logic click into place. It's like holding the only known cure to a global pandemic.
That is a great way to think about it.
If you are sitting in your house with the one vial of medicine that can cure a deadly disease sweeping across the continents, you owe it to the sick. You are in debt to them, regardless of whether you know their names or speak their language.
Exactly.
Your possession of the cure creates a moral obligation to distribute it.
And Paul had a ready mind to deliver that cure. He tells the Roman believers he is eager to visit them. This was not a tourist hoping to do some sightseeing at the Colosseum or check out the aqueducts.
He had a job to do.
He was coming as a soul winner, but we cannot skip over the massive irony of his travel plans.
Oh, the travel plans are wild. He prayed for a prosperous trip to Rome. He explicitly asked God to grant him a safe, successful journey to the capital.
He did. And God answered that prayer, but in a way that completely dismantled any chance for human boasting.
Yeah, things did not go as expected.
Not at all. Paul did not arrive in Rome on a luxury ship with a massive entourage of adoring fans.
He arrived in chains. He was arrested in Jerusalem, falsely accused by a mob, stuck in a Caesarean prison for over 2 years, endured a literal shipwreck where the boat was torn to pieces in a storm, and finally arrived in Rome as a prisoner of the emperor, chained to a Roman guard.
It is a stunning picture of divine sovereignty. God honors prayers, but he often orchestrates the fulfillment in ways that strip us of our own agenda.
Oh, true.
Paul's imprisonment was the precise vehicle God used to bring the gospel directly into Caesar's own household. As a prisoner awaiting trial before Nero, Paul was chained to members of the elite Praetorian Guard.
Talk about a captive audience.
Literally, he had a captive audience with the highest-ranking military officials in the empire, people he never would have met as a traveling street preacher.
That brings us to a statement that requires some serious unpacking. Paul is bringing a message about a crucified Jewish carpenter into the most intimidating alpha dog city on the face of the earth. And he states, I am not ashamed of the gospel.
That is a wildly bold claim, considering what Rome valued.
Right, because they valued strength.
Absolute military might. They respected conquering generals, highly disciplined legions, and sheer physical dominance. They looked down on the Jewish nation as a conquered, subjugated people.
So the cross would be a stumbling block.
Completely. The idea of worshiping a savior who allowed himself to be crucified, which was the most degrading, humiliating form of execution ever designed, specifically reserved for slaves and rebels, that message would seem like absolute lunacy to the Roman elite.
It would sound like a terrible joke. You want us, the rulers of the known world, to worship a man who was executed by our own provincial government.
Spot on. But Paul looks at Rome and he sees right through the marble facades, the grand temples, and the military parades. He knows that despite all their outward strength, they are inwardly rotting.
Wiersbe brings in some brutal quotes from philosophers of that era to prove this point.
Oh, yeah.
Seneca, who was actually a tutor to the Emperor Nero, called Rome a cesspool of iniquity. Juvenal, a Roman satirist, called it a filthy sewer into which the dregs of the empire flood.
These are their own writers describing their own society. They possessed the strongest army in the world, capable of conquering any territory they marched into, but they could not conquer their own moral decay.
So they were strong on the outside, weak on the inside.
They were a collapsing nation internally. And that is why Paul is not ashamed. He declares the gospel is the literal dynamic force and ability of God unto salvation. The Greek word he uses for ability there is dunamis, from which we get the word dynamite.
The explosive ability of God unto deliverance.
Deliverance is the key concept. The Romans viewed their emperor as a savior. They viewed their physicians as saviors. If a legion rescued a besieged city, that was salvation.
But Paul redefines the whole thing.
He argues true deliverance is an internal rescue from the penalty and the grip of sin. Rome's legions could conquer a continent, but they were completely powerless to conquer the human heart. Only the gospel possessed the ability to accomplish an internal reconstruction.
There is a specific phrase Paul uses here that causes a lot of confusion, so I want to get your analysis on it. He says this message is to the Jew first. Why does he specify that? It sounds like favoritism.
It is a common point of confusion, but no, it is not about favoritism or one ethnic group being inherently better than another.
Okay, that makes sense.
Paul spends a huge portion of this letter, specifically chapters 2 and 3, proving that there is absolutely no difference between Jew and Gentile when it comes to being condemned by sin. Every single person is guilty. To the Jew first reflects the historical timeline of the message spreading.
So it is just chronological.
Yes. Jesus was born a Jew, and during his earthly ministry, he ministered primarily to the Jewish nation. The first apostles were Jewish.
Right.
The message originated in Jerusalem and spread outward from there. So chronologically and geographically, the gospel went to the Jewish people first, and then to the Greek and Roman world. It is a statement of historical fact, not a statement of higher value.
Okay, so Paul has laid out the cure. He has established that he is carrying the righteousness of God, which is received by faith, and it has the explosive ability to deliver anyone. But before a cure makes any sense, the patient has to realize they have a fatal disease.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I walk up to you on the street and hand you a heavy dose of chemotherapy, you will reject it. You will think I'm crazy. But if we go to the hospital and the doctor puts your x-ray on the light board and shows you a massive tumor, suddenly that chemotherapy is your most prized possession.
Which brings us to the courtroom, Romans chapter 1, verse 18. This is where the tone of the letter shifts drastically. Paul brings the gavel down.
The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. This is heavy. Wiersbe points out that human history, according to Paul's argument, is not a story of evolution. It is a story of devolution.
We need to define those terms clearly within this context. The popular secular narrative is evolution in a moral and religious sense.
What does that look like?
It is the idea that humanity started low, as ignorant primitives worshiping thunderstorms, trees, and animals, and slowly climbed the intellectual ladder, eventually reaching sophisticated monotheism or enlightened philosophy.
The idea that we started in the mud, figured out how to build fire, and eventually built our way up to morality and ethics.
That is the narrative. But Paul argues the exact opposite. He states humanity started high. In the beginning, we started with the clear, undeniable knowledge of the one true God. But because of sin, humanity sank lower than the beasts. We devolved. It is a massive, ongoing downward spiral.
And the mechanism behind this downward spiral is a concept that is very central to Reformed theology. The text says humans actively suppress or hold down the truth in unrighteousness.
This is a major strike against the comforting idea that humans are born as neutral blank slates, just innocently wandering around looking for truth.
We're not neutral at all.
No. The theological claim here is total depravity. People do not lack the truth. They actively, fiercely fight against it.
The analogy I keep coming back to for suppression is holding a beach ball underwater. Have you ever tried to do that in a swimming pool?
Oh yeah, it pops right back up.
Right. You take this massive beach ball full of air and you push it under the surface. It takes constant, exhausting, deliberate physical effort to keep it down. The natural state of the beach ball is to burst to the surface. It wants to float.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The reality of God is the beach ball. It is obvious. It naturally wants to surface in our consciousness. But humanity uses all its intellect, all its philosophy, all its scientific theories, and all its excuses to force that reality beneath the surface.
And why do we do that?
Because acknowledging the Creator would mean submitting to the Creator's authority.
If God is real, I am not the boss.
Yeah.
If there's a creator, he has the right to tell the creation how to operate.
That is the core of it. If there is a holy God, I am morally accountable. So, to avoid accountability, we push the truth underwater. We suppress it. But Paul argues the evidence is simply too massive to ignore.
The evidence in creation.
Exactly. Creation itself, the heavens, the firmament, the intricate design of the universe, provides such undeniable proof of God's eternal ability and Godhead that humanity is left completely without excuse.
You look at the stars. You look at the staggering intricacy of the human eye. You look at the finely tuned laws of physics, and you cannot honestly conclude it is all a random, chaotic accident. The creation screams that there is a creator.
Which completely refutes the modern optimistic idea that people are generally good, they just lack the right information or the right environment.
You hear that all the time.
You really do. If we just educate everyone and eliminate poverty, humanity will be perfect. The biblical text insists humanity already possesses the most vital information, but aggressively rejects it. We do not have an information problem. We have a rebellion problem.
I'm tracking with you. We are in the courtroom. The prosecution has established that humanity possessed the truth, and we deliberately held it underwater. What happens next? Wiersbe breaks down Paul's argument into 4 specific stages of this downward spiral.
Yes. Intelligence, ignorance, indulgence, and impenitence. We started with intelligence knowing God through creation, but choosing to suppress that truth.
Okay, so what is the next step?
The next stage in the devolution is ignorance.
And the trigger for this ignorance is so surprising to me. It is not some massive violent crime. The downward spiral does not start with murder or theft. It starts with a failure to be thankful.
Verse 21 states, because that, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful. When humans refuse to be grateful, their hearts darken.
That is such a quiet sin, but so deadly.
It really is. They are happy to consume all of God's gifts, the oxygen they breathe, the food they eat, the intellect they use to build civilizations, but they refuse to give him the credit.
It is the ultimate form of cosmic entitlement. We act like we created the air we breathe.
And human psychology dictates that nature abhors a vacuum. If you refuse to worship the true God, you do not just stop worshiping entirely. You are a worshiping creature by design.
You will find something else.
You will find a substitute. So humanity exchanges the glory of the immortal God for idols. They start by making gods that look like men and magnifying human traits, and then the devolution continues. They sink even lower and worship birds, beasts, and creeping things.
Which echoes the original lie in the Garden of Eden. The serpent tells Eve, "Ye shall be as God." We put ourselves at the top of the pyramid, and then we worship the things below us.
That leads directly to the third stage, which is indulgence. When you act as your own God, you make your own rules. And this is where we hit one of the most frightening phrases in the entire letter. God gave them up.
I am hung up on this idea. That phrase gives me absolute chills.
It should.
When we think of the wrath of God, we usually picture lightning bolts, fire and brimstone raining down from the sky, floods wiping out cities, active, visible destruction. But this is a completely different kind of wrath.
Yes, it is passive wrath.
It sounds backwards to me. If I am angry as a parent, I intervene. I step in and stop the bad behavior. Are you saying the worst punishment isn't fire and brimstone, but just autonomy?
You hit the nail on the head. It is passive wrath, and it is infinitely more terrifying than a lightning bolt. God gave them up means God taking his hands off the steering wheel.
Wow.
It is God saying, you want a world without my interference. You want to be your autonomous God and follow your own desires. Thy will be done. He removes his restraining grace and allows humanity to suffer the natural destructive consequences of their own rebellion.
He lets us have exactly what we want. He just lets go of the leash.
And what we want without his restraint destroys us. The human heart, left to its own devices, will sprint towards self-destruction. This is where Paul connects idolatry directly to immorality. The two are inextricably linked.
Let's look at that link. Why does making a false god always lead to bad behavior? Why is making a wooden statue tied to moral decay?
Because you design a God who agrees with your lifestyle. If you invent your own deity, you're going to design a God who permits your specific desires. You remove all the moral guardrails.
That makes total sense.
Right. If your manufactured God does not care about purity or honesty or fidelity, then you are free to indulge in whatever you want without any guilt. You have manufactured a divine permission slip for your own lusts. You create a God in your own image who approves of your own sins.
So the downward spiral accelerates. We go from knowing God to ignoring him through ingratitude, to indulging ourselves because God takes his hands off the wheel.
Yep.
And finally, we hit the absolute rock bottom, which is impenitence.
This is the fourth and final stage. The text says God gave them over to a reprobate mind, a depraved mind.
How bad does it get?
At this point, the human mind is so broken, so twisted by sin, it cannot even form right judgments anymore. Up is down, wrong is right, bitter is sweet. The compass is completely smashed.
Paul lists 24 specific sins in this section. It reads like a modern news feed. He lists envy, murder, deceit, maliciousness, backbiters, haters of God, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents.
It is a heavy list.
It is a comprehensive catalog of human ruin. It covers everything from violent crime to gossiping behind someone's back.
But the absolute bottom of the barrel is not just committing these 24 sins. It is the very last verse of the chapter.
What does he say?
Paul says, they know the judgment of God, they know these things deserve death, but they not only do them, they have pleasure in them that do them. They applaud the evil in others.
They throw a parade for the rebellion. It is one thing to fail, To fall into sin in a moment of weakness and feel ashamed of it. It is another thing entirely to institutionalize it, to celebrate it, and to demand that everyone else in society celebrate it too.
That requires a totally seared conscience.
That is the ultimate proof of a reprobate mind. When a culture begins to reward the very things that are destroying it, you know the devolution is complete. And it brings us back to the verdict of the courtroom. Humanity is guilty. We are without excuse.
Wiersbe quotes Dan Crawford, a British missionary who spent decades in Africa. He said something chilling about the human condition. The heathen are sinning against a flood of light.
A flood of light, not a tiny flicker in the distance. A flood.
The issue is not that it is too dark to see the truth. The issue is that humanity hates the light because the light exposes what we are doing in the dark. We are sinning against a flood of light.
We are holding the beach ball underwater while standing in the middle of a blazing spotlight.
That captures the absurdity and the tragedy of the human condition. The evidence is overwhelming. The diagnosis is terminal. We are completely dead in our trespasses.
And Paul has to establish this.
He does. He has to establish this pitch-black backdrop, this total inability of humanity to save itself, before he can introduce the blinding light of justification by faith in the upcoming chapters.
The chemotherapy only makes sense once you see the tumor. To recap the massive scale of what we have covered in this deep dive, we saw Paul, the voluntary bondslave, bringing a message of verifiable historical fact to the elite, arrogant city of Rome.
We broke down his unashamed confidence in the gospel's explosive ability to rescue the human heart from the inside out.
We look at the undeniable proof of a creator in the firmament, leaving us totally without excuse. And we walk through the sobering reality of human devolution, the downward spiral that happens when we suppress the truth, refuse to give thanks, and force God to hand us over to our own depraved minds.
It is a heavy, devastating diagnosis, but it is the only way the cure of grace actually makes sense.
As we wrap up this session, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We talked about ancient people worshiping birds, beasts, and bugs to suppress the truth of a holy creator. It sounds primitive to us.
Yeah, we think we are past all that.
We look back and think, I would never bow down to a carved wooden beetle or a golden calf. But what highly sophisticated modern idols do you and I manufacture today to keep the beach ball held underwater?
That is the real question.
Is it our careers? Is it our political tribes? Is it our obsession with technology and constant entertainment? What shiny, socially acceptable substitutes are we using right now to distract ourselves from the courtroom of God?
The human heart has not changed a bit since AD 56. We just upgraded the materials we use to build our idols.
We certainly did. Thank you for joining this session of Reformed Thinking. We encourage you to carefully evaluate the evidence presented today in your own life. See you next time.